Almost 700 students have been arrested overnight in Canada in the latest protests in Quebec over high university tuition fees. The rallies have been going on for over 100 days now. Quebec's provincial government last week passed emergency legislation in an attempt to end Canada's longest-running student demonstrations ever. That, however, did not bring any peace to the streets. And we're now joined live by Andrew Gavin Marshall, project manager for peoplesbookproject.com. Andrew Gavin Marshall, thank you so much for talking to us here on our team. Now, my first question to you is the protests have lasted for more than 100 days now. What is the future of the movement?
Well, now it's a social movement. It's being referred to as the Maple Spring. And on the one hand, you have the government becoming more repressive, passing Bill 78 last week, which severely restricts our constitutionally guaranteed rights to freedom of assembly and freedom of expression. So you have a crackdown, a totalitarian-like crackdown by a mafia-connected government on a student movement. And on the other hand, you have a student movement which is becoming more resilient, more energized to react against this freedom-attacking legislation. And the issue is no longer tuition. Our very freedom is at stake here. So you have two sort of parallel trends taking place, increased repression and increased mobilization on the other side. I mean, just since the legislation was passed, we've had over 1,000 people arrested, and the legislation came into effect on Saturday. In the entire conflict, we've had over 2,500 people arrested. Several students have almost been killed by the police. One lost his eye, another lost his vision. And someone is ended up in the hospital with a skull fracture and brain contusion. Police violence has been excessive and consistent, and it's increasing with over 500 people arrested last night in the city, taking part in a protest, which was a peaceful protest, which was declared illegal before it even began. And that's really the reality that we see. So it's becoming a social movement. It's bringing in other groups, unions, environmental groups and causes, and people are becoming mobilized around the issue, and it's also internationalizing. We've seen solidarity protests in New York, in Toronto, in Vancouver, in Calgary, in Paris. The issue is not simply about what's happening in Quebec. It's about what's happening to my generation around the world, whether you're in Egypt or Tunisia or Chile or Spain or right here in Quebec. We're fighting against global austerity measures imposed by an elite who simply want more for themselves and less for everyone else.
Now, Andrew, let me just interrupt you there a little bit, because you talked about the violence that's been happening since this new legislation came in. Now, just touch a little bit on what this legislation is really about. Some say it's about an infringement of freedom of expression. What do you think?
Well, it absolutely is. It's not only an infringement on freedom of expression, but also freedom of assembly, which are two rights guaranteed by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Not only that, but it imposes heavy fines upon people, leaders, and organizations which not only lead protests, but simply participate in them. So if you are a student and you participate in a protest which is declared illegal, and they all are illegal now under this law, you could be fined between $1,000 and $5,000. If you are a student leader, you can be fined between $7,000 and $35,000. If you're a student association, you can be fined up to $125,000 for the first offense, going up to $250,000 for the second offense. It's designed to bankrupt the student associations which have been leading and mobilizing this movement. And it's essentially, as one student leader said, it's a declaration of war on the student movement. And even the Quebec Bar Association has spoken out against it. A law professor in Quebec has said it's the worst piece of legislation since the War Measures Act, which was put in place in 1970 and was an actual declaration of martial law. So this bill, Bill 78, is a pseudo-declaration of martial law against the student movement in Quebec. And it has to be stopped, and Jean Charest, our premier, has to resign. He's a disgrace, and his administration is funding and working with organized crime while they oppose and repress organized students. The hypocrisy is unbelievable, and a great deal is at stake right now.
Now, this seems to be like mirroring the situation in the U.S., where people are swamped by student debt, while experts actually predict a second wave of the economy crisis. Are we likely to see that the U.S. scenario repeated in Canada in terms of these austerity measures and these protests going on for longer?
Absolutely. I mean, the average student debt in the United States is about $24,000 for undergraduates. In Canada, it's actually higher at $27,000. The average Canadian household has a $103,000 debt, spends 150% of their annual income, which means for every dollar earned, they spend $1.50. We're facing a massive debt crisis, but it's a debt crisis among the population and among the students. In Quebec, we have half the average student debt in Canada at $13,000 for the average undergraduate. We're fighting to prevent being thrown off the cliff with the rest of Canada, and the rest of Canada and the United States should in fact mobilize and look to Quebec as an example because they have it even worse than we do in terms of debt and tuition, and they should really start looking to Quebec as an example to mobilize themselves and to struggle against these educational austerity measures, which simply benefit the rich and make everyone else suffer.
Isn't there a discrepancy here, though? I mean, Canada is one of the top 20 countries listed by defense spending, yet it's now cutting back on social programs. No attack apparent, but it has money for arms and no social needs. You know, how does that work out? I mean, we have money for arms, but we have money for no education. Is that what the feeling everybody else is feeling out there in Montreal?
Absolutely. I mean, if you want to know the moral standing of a government, you look at their spending priorities. Prime Minister Stephen Harper likes to spend more on multi-billion-dollar jets from Lockheed Martin, a major warmongering military company in the United States. He's building more prisons in Canada, spending billions and billions of dollars on foreign wars to oppress people in foreign countries. But there's no money for education here at home. In Quebec, it's very similar. There's money to give. The mafia in Quebec owns the construction industry, and they get about 80% of all construction contracts in the province. It's a huge scandal right now. There's an inquiry which has just been opened after 2 years of Premier Jean Charest refusing, for obvious reasons, to open the inquiry. And the mafia construction industry gets contracts to build horribly built bridges and roads which fall apart, and they charge between 60 and 200% more than the national average. So there's money for the mafia, but there's no money for students. And the simple reason is because the mafia, with their extra money, throws fundraisers for the Liberal Party and for Jean Charest's cabinet ministers. For example, our education minister just resigned last week after revelations emerged that she attended a fundraiser back in 2009, which was in part hosted by a mafioso boss here in Montreal.
Right,
and her
Andrew,
response was...
I'm going to have to interrupt you right there, but thank you so much for being with us. Andrew Gavin Marshall, live from Montreal, talking to us there about the latest that's happening in Montreal. Thank you so much for being here with us on our team.